Thank you all for joining us on a cloudy spring afternoon. As always, it's wonderful to be with you. My name is Scott St. Louis, and I have the privilege of serving as the program manager for the Common Ground Initiative in the Hauenstein Center here at Grand Valley State University. We appreciate the presence of GVSU President Emeritus Don Lubbers today, as well as Winston Elliott, publisher of The Imaginative Conservative. I'd like to begin also by thanking the partnership organizations that have helped the Hauenstein Center make today's gathering possible. To Karen Zivy and Noreen Myers of the Progressive Women's Alliance of West Michigan, and to Chris Beers representing Annette Kirk from the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal, we are so grateful for your support. Please join me in a round of applause. It's my pleasure to give quick introductions for this afternoon's event, which will be followed by a special town hall session right here in Loosemore Auditorium. We hope that you will share with our three speakers your own questions and thoughts about pursuing common ground for the common good in our age of political and cultural hyperpolarization. Please use the microphones at the end of each aisle to share your questions at the end of today's program. Our first speaker this afternoon will be Elisabeth Lasch-Quinn, Professor of History and Senior Research Associate in the Campbell Public Affairs Institute at Syracuse University. Professor Lasch-Quinn focuses on ideas and their intricacy, inner workings, and importance in the lives of individuals and society, past and present. In addition to modern and contemporary American social, cultural, and intellectual history, she has broader interests extending back to antiquity, especially philosophy, comparative literature, cultural and media criticism, languages, and classical reception. Her current book project, tentatively titled Ars Vitae, The Fate of Inwardness and the Return of the Ancient Arts of Living, is forthcoming from the University of Notre Dame Press. The book explores ideas in ancient Greco-Roman philosophy and modern American culture about how to live. Her writing appears widely in scholarly and prominent public venues such as the New Republic and the Hedgehog Review, and includes numerous essays, articles, op-eds, and book reviews on a range of subjects, from race and community to civil society, therapeutic culture, democratic citizenship, self, emotion, moral imagination, children, popular culture, love, and the life of the mind. A Fulbright Fellow, Professor Lasch-Quinn has received research grants and fellowships from the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale University, the Pew and Templeton Foundations, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. Following Professor Lasch-Quinn will be Bradley J. Birzer, Professor of History and Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies at Hillsdale College. Professor Birzer is celebrating his 20th year of teaching at Hillsdale. He's a co-founder of the online journal, The Imaginative Conservative, to which he frequently contributes, and is also a scholar at large for the American Conservative magazine. Professor Birzer has been a fellow of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and the McConnell Center at the University of Louisville. During the 2014-2015 academic term, he served as visiting scholar of conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado Boulder. His biography of Russell Kirk, published in 2015 by the University Press of Kentucky, won the Henry and Ann Paolucci Book Award from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Professor Birzer has also published books on Charles Carroll, the last living signatory of the Declaration of Independence, the British Catholic historian Christopher Dawson, President Andrew Jackson, Lord of the Rings author J.R.R. Tolkien, and the rock band drummer and lyricist Neil Peart. Bradley and Elisabeth are joined today by our fearless leader, Gleaves Whitney. Gleaves has been the first full-time director of the Hauenstein Center since 2003, presiding over its growth into the preeminent presidential study center in the Midwest. During his tenure, the Hauenstein Center has produced hundreds of public events, with many covered by C-SPAN. These events have included the famous God and War debate between brothers Christopher and Peter Hitchens, referenced on 60 Minutes, as well as a conversation between the famous intellectual sparring partners Robert P. George and Cornel West, and the biennial Character in the Presidency series initiated in partnership with Hank Meyer and Peter Secchia. Gleaves has brought fellows of the Hauenstein Center's Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy face-to-face with 4 U.S. presidents, 3 first ladies, 2 vice presidents, 4 secretaries of state, 6 state governors, multiple Pulitzer Prize-winning writers, a Grammy Award winner, and the national championship basketball coach, among many others. The events and encounters Gleaves has pursued continue to raise the profile of Grand Valley State University at national and international levels alike. Gleaves also finds the time to contribute to scholarship on the American presidency and Midwestern history. He's authored or edited 16 books, with several more on the way. Please help me in giving our speakers one more welcome with a round of applause.
I want to begin with a scene from a movie. Now, it may not be a movie you've seen, but you might want to see it after, or you might really not want to see it after, but you might also recognize it if you've seen this movie. And then I will go on to give some comments about my own work in progress, the book Ars Vitae, which means the art of living, and also to show how I think the work I'm doing, I hope, will contribute to the kinds of vital things that the Hauenstein Center is doing to keep dialogue alive, to keep democracy alive by doing that, and to practice what I think is most vital today, which is the art of living, which includes the art of conversation with one another and the art of citizenship. So first, let me start with this little scene from a famous movie called Interstellar. So I don't know if you've seen it. So I'll describe it. An astronaut's spaceship is way out into space. He is expelled from the spaceship into space itself. He's cast out into the great beyond, all by himself, in a wall-less cavern of nothingness, loneliness, and meaninglessness. Yet, in place of his life passing before his eyes, instead, he has a glimpse of a brief and specific moment in his past where he made a grave mistake. It's the thing he regrets more than anything. And strangely, he might have a chance to do it all over again. So there's a bend in the space-time continuum, and we can all go back and maybe fix something back there. He has a vision out there in space. He sees the bookshelf in the bedroom of his 10-year-old daughter, and that's where they argued, because at this time, our own planet Earth was dying out and no crops could be made, and so he was an astronaut, so he talked with his daughter, and his wife had died, her mother, so he said, I need to go out and save the human race by finding another planet. So he spent his life doing that, and he thought no love was holding him on since he had lost his wife. However, as the years went on, he felt more and more pain about leaving his daughter behind. And the only way they could ever communicate was a few communications on Skype or the computerized telephone, FaceTime, that kind of thing. And that's not very satisfying because for her entire growing up years, she did not have her father, any parent, with her. So this experience shattered his soul and his self into shards. But then all of a sudden, in the darkness out in outer space, came random flashes of light of varying intensities, from blinding sun force light to those gentle eye floaters that are specks across our field of vision. His boots clanged on a metal grill and he started falling at great speed through a shaft until all of a sudden a room opened up into outer space. It was the most beautiful vision he had ever seen. He was floating there in a special time within time and space within space, cordoned off from the night sky with shafts of light of all colors speeding by horizontally and vertically all around him, those light beams that are nicknamed God's light that sometimes come in through the window or are coming down from clouds in a sunset. And it was the most beautiful thing that he ever could imagine. And it became the books and the bookshelves of her room. And all of a sudden, there she was in this room, and he could see her across time. And he could also see her at the age that she would currently be at. So it was a very strange thing, and remember, it is a movie. But what happened to make this possible, to make it possible that there would be another whole dimension, as we're always thinking, is there another dimension out there? And the answer is, if you've, I don't know if you've seen that movie Interstellar, but you probably have a guess anyway. The dimension, the extra dimension that we're always looking for is quite simply love. Love is what can conquer time and space, and it does so all the time. Our hearts are that other dimension, and they get all kinds of places, and they can understand, they get us to understand people and care for things and places, care for the world. So that's the ultimate mystery. I'll just say, not just of that movie, but it's one of the ultimate mysteries, isn't it? And actually, that's as Platonic as you can possibly get. That is Plato and many other poets and theologians and philosophers and architects envisioning a room like that. Many creative people, many everyday people who use their heart to imagine all kinds of things that would never be there otherwise. Well, Platonism is rooted in the thought of Plato, going way back to the golden age of Athenian philosophy. Perhaps one of his most famous works today is the Symposium. And I think it's probably much more likely that this audience has read the Symposium than perhaps seen Interstellar. I'm not sure. But this is a dialogue, Plato's dialogue about the dinner party, where all of the participants decide that they'll each get up and give a speech on what is the meaning of love. What is love? What is the definition of love? And we hear all these other speeches, and finally it culminates with Socrates' speech. And in a fascinating twist, Socrates says it's not even his idea, that he learned it from a female philosopher he thought was absolutely brilliant, named Diotima. So his speech actually is recounting her speech. And Plato, by some, has actually been called the first feminist. So the idea that all ancient philosophers were somehow members of the white male elite that should be dismissed and never heard of is not at all accurate in many cases, and really should never be thought. So Diotima said, Socrates, all people are pregnant, men and women. Women often give birth to a child, but all people give birth or are capable of giving birth in their soul to something beautiful in the world. And creative activity of all kinds, meaningful work, all of those ways that people bring beauty into the world, she counted that as a kind of a pregnancy and a giving birth and a creation of one's soul. That's how the soul was created. It's also the taste that mortal man, mortal woman, have of the divine. It's our access to the divine. That was Diotima. And she went on to describe a very visceral image of how this happens. It sounds like a very abstract notion, but she nailed it down. And she said that the way it happens is we all are capable of climbing the ladder of love, she called it. It begins when a person falls in love with a particular person or a thing, and its beauty. Then this one starts making you see the beauty in other people and other things that are like that. And you keep going up the ladder until finally you become a lover of all beautiful bodies, all beautiful things. From this revelation, one grasps the value of the beauty of souls as even higher than the body. And as we ascend the ladder, the beauty of all of our observances, our laws, our connections in kinship, in fellowship, our branches of knowledge, all become one beautiful thing that we can love. And the view from the top is one of unparalleled beauty, love, spiritual peace, harmony, and glory. And it's a love of knowledge, of wisdom. And the meaning of beauty here is actually moral goodness, inner worth. It's not anything superficial like what passes for beauty in our times often. This vision, Diotimus Latter, Socrates' speech in the Symposium, has influenced generations of philosophers ever since. It has influenced major world religions. It has influenced theologians. The thinker Augustine was greatly enamored of this vision of Plato and the Neoplatonists. And on up until closer to our own time, this vision was inspiring to Martin Luther King Jr., the great hero of the American Civil Rights Movement, who has helped democracy become more of what it can be. And he certainly put his time into helping our democracy stay together. And the night before he died, he gave a famous speech called the Mountaintop speech, where he said, "I've been to the mountaintop." And he also said that if he had been allowed to go and travel through time and space, he would start by going back to the ancient philosophers. And then he would come back up and stop all kinds of places, including the Italian Renaissance, and keep on coming. He was very influenced by the ancient Greco-Roman philosophy and the entire Western intellectual tradition and beyond. And if you hear his mountaintop speech, it's this beautiful speech where he already knew he was getting death threats all the time. And he was sweating and ill, but he gave this speech anyway. And it's one of his many rousing speeches that was aimed to bring people together and was dedicated toward a concept called the beloved community, that we can do better than just merely tolerate one another. We can love one another and be part of a beautiful polity that's an example throughout the world. So that vision of the mountaintop, from the mountaintop, is of course also a religious vision. So I'm not trying to say it's all from Plato, but it's a vision that we have in many works. It comes up again and again, this idea that there's this glorious oneness of peace and harmony that is out there. It's an ideal, but just if we lose sight of the ideal, we'll never know how do you generate peace and harmony in everyday life. The idea that love is that important of a force comes up again and again, although it seems we've forgotten it lately. Martin Luther King said that love is the most, quote, "love is the most powerful force in the world," unquote. And many activists and leaders have thought that love is an actual part of our political philosophy of democracy, that without it, none of it makes sense. A kind of civic love. So Platonism has also had a great impact on Islam. And so when we're looking for common ground, I think the more we can go back to intellectual traditions of shared principles and shared visions of what's possible between people and in societies, I think we find the deeper common ground rather than anything just sort of tritely thrown out there as, oh, we have this in common, maybe we have common self-interest. Well, I think we need something far more than self-interest. We're in that much trouble now with the polarization that we see, and there's self-interest everywhere. So shared self-interest will not get us very far, but a vision of beauty and love, I think, is much more promising. So going back to Plato and all of the people influenced by him, many great artists and musicians were also influenced by him. You may have heard Serenade by Leonard Bernstein. He wrote a whole beautiful piece of classical music based on the Symposium, and it has as many movements as there are speeches. So each movement is an interpretation in music of a philosophical speech in Plato's dialogue. So you have to hear that, promise me, if you haven't. And if you hear it, you can, in the part that is Socrates' speech, you can hear what musically the walking up and seeing the view from the top of the ladder of love is. You can hear how that was interpreted musically by the composer Leonard Bernstein. So today, many people seek help and insight for how to live in hard times. It's easy to throw up our hands and give up on other people who disagree with us. But I see so many signs of promise. It seems to be a terrible time in many ways, and a remarkably exciting time in other ways. And I'm writing this book on the art of living, because I see these ancient philosophies coming back now, and I'm trying to take a sounding of that movement. There is really serious yearning for something different from all generations. You see it in college students, you see it in people at the height of their career, whether they're a lawyer or a professor or builder. You see it in people in retirement wanting something more than just, oh, good, freedom to enjoy the consumer society, which maybe wasn't really what their life was about anyway. And so people are, and then there are other terrible signs of distress. We have very high suicide rates. It's very alarming. Very high addiction rates. People leaving institutions, leaving relationships. We clearly have a problem at the level of community making, community building, family, institutions of all kinds. We need to renew the essence of our very vital institutions in a way that can bring agreement among people rather than polarizing people. So, let's see. So I think that everywhere we look, whether we're talking about philosophy deliberately or we're just doing what we do in our everyday life, our philosophies of life pervade everything that we do. They're behind everything. Why was this event designed this way? Why did you fit this into your day? Why did I do this research and present it? It's everywhere. And if we don't think deliberately about it, that could contribute to the cultural chaos that we see around us. So there are many things in advertising and some kinds of politics and things that come from a lack of attention to a deliberate philosophy of life that would be renewing of our bonds with one another. So today, many people seek answers, but they have nowhere to turn because our culture has been sort of taken over by the self-help culture. So they will go to the self-help aisle or go to the libraries, and they'll find a lot of books, but the advice is often competing with one another. One says, find your true career and make as much money as you can possibly get no matter what. So just focus on yourself and ignore everyone. Another will say, give back to your community, build yourself, practice mindfulness and things. There are so many competing things. If we don't think about it more seriously than just tossing off a few self-help nostrums, we will get in more serious trouble. And I think that's partly our problem, is that we've given over the serious task of thinking about how we live our lives to pretty lightweight and sort of fleeting advisors who are just often trying to make money off of a self-help book. Sometimes they're more earnest than that. But even if they're well-meaning, sometimes it's not a philosophy that's going to help us live together and love one another. Today we allow the humanities, which is the traditional repository of all of this wisdom about our human condition, to wither away. and in their place only remains slogans and lists. There's a generalized discontentment, resentment, and sense of victimization that pit us against one another. So I think what I would leave you with is the idea that we need a world that is safe for our self-making and our soul-making. While we talk a lot about sustainability today, we think mainly of the inanimate resources around us. This is crucial that we do that. Yet, these resources are related to the interpersonal and personal resources that are needed and absolutely vital for any kind of sustainable human bonds. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having us, Elisabeth. That was absolutely beautiful, and lots to think about. As we get started here, as I get started and try and close out this hour of presentations and answer at least some of what Elisabeth said, I do want to thank a couple of people. So I want to thank Gleaves, of course, for everything that he's put together in the Hauenstein Center. Just an amazing. Gleaves has been, we were talking last night at dinner, how do we regard our own academic mentors? And I had some very good academic mentors, but I can say without question that Gleaves has been mine over the last 20 plus years. So that means a great deal to me to be a part of this. Winston Elliott has also done so much for the Hauenstein Center and elsewhere, and I want to thank him as well. And let's see, Sam, who hooked me up and did a really good job doing that. Thank you, Sam. And also Autumn, great. So anyway, thank you all for being here. And it's wonderful to be able to speak about these things and these topics. So I had never met Elisabeth before last night, and I found very quickly as we were having dinner together that there was a definite kinship there. And here we are, I think we're trying to find common ground, but she is, at least at some level, looking at the world slightly differently than I do. And here I am looking at it through my eyes. And yet I can't help but think that we have almost everything in common. And I found two things, though, during her speech and in our discussion last night that I think we would disagree upon, but you'll see here that one is immensely trivial, and the other, I think, is more a matter of looking at words and defining them than anything else. So the one thing I was pretty shocked about last night is that she really likes Elton John. That was not, I would go for Led Zeppelin. So that was the first real difference. But on a serious note, I've noticed several times, we had interviews this morning with the radio, very interesting how Elisabeth talks a lot about democracy. I can honestly say I never talk about democracy. I always talk about the republic. And I found that very interesting that we would focus in different ways on that. From my understanding, and especially from the understanding of the American founding, democracy was a very necessary part of the republic, but it was merely a part. It was never meant to be the whole. So I hope that's something that maybe we can talk about a little bit more. I also tend to think of democracy as very selfish, and I think of republics as very insular, not in a selfish sense, but in the sense of loving the good thing, the community as a whole, as opposed to the individual. So I hope that's one. I don't think we need to talk about Elton John or Led Zeppelin, but I do hope that we talk somewhat about the nature of a republic. So to begin my own talk, now having just thrown in a few comments, I want to read from one of my favorite Michiganders, I realize. There's still debate on which term it should be. But I want to read from a favorite person who passed away in 1994 and lived just right up in Mecosta, Michigan. It was really the founder of post-war conservatism, Russell Kirk. And he was always very deeply interested in the notions of imagination. And so as he thought about the human person, and I think this is something Elisabeth and I are both probably rather obsessed about, trying to define, trying to understand, trying to promote, trying to leaven the human person, Kirk was always interested that we balance the three parts, that is, we balance the faculties that we all have. So, and we can see this is being discussed in Plato. We find it, Cicero is very explicit about this in the Roman Republic, and then people like C.S. Lewis in the last 100 years, especially in the Abolition of Man, take up this tripartite or this three-part understanding of the human person, that we know things through our rationality. We can observe things, we can calculate, we can know there maybe in some ways is the self-interest. There we have this thing weighed against this thing. We observe, there's a logic to it. And then down below in the stomach and the procreative regions, we have the passions, those things that we're drawn to, maybe because we're attracted to them, or we're hungry, or whatever it may be. But Kirk always talked, as did Cicero, that the highest of all things is really that faculty in the middle, the chest, the idea of bridging that which is rational with that which is passionate. And this, both Cicero and Kirk always discussed as, maybe we could call it a soul, but it's also the imagination. It's the ability to see beyond what our lust is or what our longings are, but it's also the ability to see beyond just what is rational. And for someone like Cicero, who argued at the end of the Roman Republic that this would be the only thing that could hold humans together, regardless of the accidents of birth. Cicero famously said, it didn't matter if you were a citizen of Athens or Rome, if you were in the past or the present or the future, this is the thing that holds us all together. It is that image. It is the ability to see past someone's skin tone or to see past their sexuality, see past the things which they adorn themselves with, and understand that we carry that same essence within, whether we're past, present, or future, whether we're Adam or the last man, male or female. There's this thing that holds us together. And Cicero talked about this as all of us being members of the cosmopolis, the heavenly republic, the republic of all good women and men, those who live of goodwill and who are willing to engage with one another across time. And essentially, this is my view of what the humanities are. The humanities, properly understood, are not a cafeteria-style pick this or that. They are about engaging with previous generations, understanding what is the wisdom of the ages, and then through prudence, trying to discern what can we pass on, what should we pass on with comments, and what should we not pass on? Those are our decisions. So when we inherit tradition, we have to judge. Does this thing need to be done away with? Does it need to be reformed? That's almost always the most likely result. Or should we just pass it on without comment? But this is the duty of every generation, and really of every good person. It's not easy. And I think one thing that Elisabeth and I would both very much agree upon, no matter how bad the world is at the moment, we're not going to get out of it anytime soon. This is going to take hard work. And certainly we've been in other extraordinary and very dark times before in our history. Everybody has. This is the nature of humanity, depending on where your own religious views might be, whether we take this as a true story or as a symbolic one. Things have been pretty bad since the first few days of Eden. Genesis 1 is glorious. Genesis 2, things start breaking down. Genesis 3, it's all gone to hell. I mean, you've got 50 chapters in Genesis. One is great, one is in the middle, the rest are terrible. Right? This is life, and this is what we have to deal with. It's a constant thing. We're not going to perfect ourselves here and now, but we can understand the experience of those who have come before us. So Russell Kirk, this great man of Michigan, this great man of letters, born and raised in Plymouth, Michigan, ultimately settling up in Mecosta, wrote in 1977, and this was a speech that he gave at Hillsdale College. He said, on the meaning of imagination, he said, we must understand that how we define imagination is how we define ourselves, whether we think of the imagination as moral or idyllic or diabolic. Images are representations of mysteries necessarily, for mere words and tools break in the hand, and it never pleased God that man should be saved by logic, by abstract reason alone. Instead, images can draw us very, very high to the high dream, as Dante's dream did, but they can also draw us down into the abyss. It is images more than anything else, and certainly more than some narrowly deductive or inductive process that has always given us the greatest of philosophy and the greatest of scientific insights and poetry. Real philosophy has always been about seeing those things that are not ephemeral, but eternal. And that, I think, Kirk, is absolutely right. we have to understand that in each generation, we do have the ability, and now more than ever, to be distracted by the media, to be distracted by everything. I mean, look at what happened in the congressional hearings this week. These absurdities debating about whether or not someone should stay for 15 more minutes, and who has charge, and who has the gavel. And these are our governors who are just absolutely throwing away our money in these absurdities. And we can delight ourselves. We can watch that on YouTube over and over again, just as we can watch the cats rolling with one another and being playful. And it's all at the same level of entertainment, and it's all at the same level of significance. Frankly, the cats are more attractive. And this is where we have to understand we are in this period where we can have distraction everywhere, but there are also these blessings. Imagine someone who could never have gotten published 20 years ago because simply could not have been able to get into the New York market. Now you can publish an ebook. It's not beautiful. It's not the same thing as having an actual book, but your idea catches on in a different market and you've made it. We've decentralized this process. Publishers are not happy with it. Record producers especially are very upset that you can now just make an album in your basement or in your garage and then you can release it to anybody who wants it. We've gotten rid of the middlemen, and there is good and there is bad in all of that. Right now, I could instantly, and I won't take the time to do this, but with this glorious gift of Steve Jobs, may he rest in peace, I could within moments call up every single great work of literature up until 1924, right here on my iPad. Right? It's all legal, it's all there, but what do we do with it? We're not generally pulling up and reading the Symposium, which would be excellent. We're watching the cats or we're watching the Congress humans going back and forth against each other. It's more entertaining. But that doesn't mean, and that doesn't limit this technology. It just means we've chosen very poorly, but we can choose well. And that's one of the things I think we have to think about. How do we pass that on to the next generation? How do we convince them that reading The Lord of the Rings is better than watching the Peter Jackson movie, or better than immersing oneself in a video game for hours? What is it about the moral imagination that comes with reading the story, enjoying that community with Professor Tolkien and yourself through this grand mythology that he created in the 20th century? Those are the questions we have to ask. We're not going to get rid of the technology short of an EMP blast, which I assume none of us would want. We're not going to get rid of it. We're not going to see it go away. It's only going to become more individual. And we have to understand, what do we do with that? What is the power of that image? Why is it that our young people so desperately want to go into battle in a video game? Why do they want to do that? Probably in large part because they're not getting that kind of romance in their real lives. They're not getting the struggle of good versus evil in junior high, but they can go into these games and become paladins and priests, and they can go out and be the good guy. They can do these things. And I understand that. At my age, I can't even look at a video game. I get instantly sick with all that motion. I can't do it. But I understand why my students might do that, or why my children do, because they're not being challenged elsewhere. And that is a place where you can literally, well, symbolically, electronically put on the armor of the good and go fight dragons in ways that you can't do in the classroom. Not readily, not unless you're part of groupthink. This is a way to get out of that. So I want us to think about this idea then of what is it that we're inheriting and how do we decide these things? What is good? What is bad? And I want to follow. And so please know, Elisabeth and I had not met each other until last night. I was kind of stunned at how similar our ideas were, not because of politics, but simply because as you were reading your talk, as you were going through your talk, we were doing almost exactly the same thing, but you hadn't heard mine yet. So please know, none of this was planned at all. But I also wanted to go back, actually a little earlier than Plato, and I'd like to broaden it just a little bit as well. So my own understanding and my own scholarship has been rooted deeply in the Western tradition. And every fall at Hillsdale College, I get to introduce 18, 17, and 18-year-olds to the great ideas of the West. We begin with Genesis and we go through, we don't actually read the Symposium. I'm not sure what my 18-year-olds would do with parts of the Symposium, but we do read the Crito. We read the great explanation of Socrates to his best friend Crito, trying to explain why is it that Socrates should take the hemlock, even though it seems to be unjust at the moment. This is a timeless question. It's a question of justice. It's a question of right and wrong. It's a question of the individual and the community. These things that we wrestle with, whether we know it blatantly or not, all of the time. And students come to see that very quickly, that there is a beauty, there is an order to the mind and to the soul that has always been there, but maybe has yet to be seen. So I would actually like to take us back for about 110 years prior to Plato, about 100 years before this incredible moment in the history of world civilizations, right around 510 BC. And I draw on the work here, not my own. This all comes from the great man of letters, historical sociologist and sociologist Robert Nisbet. But in his own study of the world, he finds this fascinating thing, something that I don't think others had seen before Nisbet had. And that is, if you look at almost every major civilization in the old world, I'm skipping North and South America here. Obviously, there were very high civilizations here, but we don't have the records of what they were doing in 510 BC, besides a few archaeological things. We do actually have written records from the old world at this time. And one of the unusual things about 510 BC, it's not only the year in which the Romans throw off the Etruscans and then over the next year found the Second Republic in world history, but at the same moment, you have a number of philosophers in this tiny little town that's now underwater on the Turkish coast called Miletus, in which you have people like Heraclitus and Thales and others that are trying to argue what is universally true. But it's not just there in the Greeks. You find the same debates almost exactly are going on in Persia, and they're going on in India, and they're going on in China, all around 510. And we have no idea why. What is it about the year 510 that brings this awakening? But there is an awakening, and we know it's there. And here's the key to this. In every one of those cultures, whether we're talking about Heraclitus or whether we're talking about a Chinese thinker, in every one of those cultures, we see that there is a switch in understanding from ethics, which are always in group, how do I treat my neighbor, to morality, which is out group. Do I treat my enemy in the same way that I treat my neighbor? And that is a profound jump in thought and consciousness, to recognize that that being not part of your tribe is someone worthy of respect, or at least understanding. Now, you may still end up slaughtering them, but you may talk to them before you do that. And that's a jump. That's a leap. And I think one of the craziest things we see right now, and I don't think we can blame technology, though certainly technology has played a role, we're finding increased tribalism everywhere. This tribalism, us versus them, the tribalism of, well, I may listen to one response you've given me and then I close the door. Right? There's nowhere right now in any significant area of government or in academia where you have true, sustained dialogue. And I won't say nowhere. We're doing it right now, and that's great. It's amazing. But what Gleaves is doing here is unfortunately not the model right now for the world. The world continues to narrow and narrow and narrow. And one of the great ironies, of course, is that the more tribal we become, the more alike we actually become. In this desire to be so individual, we end up being like everybody else. And that's crazy, and that's something I think we need to talk about as well. But I want to jump forward just a little bit from 510. And I love the kind of litany that Elisabeth gave us in thinking about these various figures from Plato. And maybe there's an irony in Elisabeth, a woman focusing on Plato, and me, Brad, a male, focusing on the other side, that is, the females of the time. But I also, in a way that I love thinking about Heraclitus, and I get to teach this, or Socrates, or Cicero, or St. Augustine, for me, the really great figures of Western civilization are not necessarily those thinkers, but those who are willing to give everything they have for that thought to continue. And so I love the great thought. It has to be there. But I immediately think of Antigone, and then I think of Perpetua and Felicity and Cecilia. Those are the people in my mind who so make real these thoughts that we see. Plato, and imagine this, and here's where I'm going to get a little bit mythological here for a moment, and we can take this any way that we want, but just think about this litany for a moment, and you can take it anywhere you want. For those of you who've read the Crito, it's a great story. Right? Socrates has been condemned to death. Athens wants to kill him. He could escape at any time. Athens would actually probably feel better about them. The Athenians would if he would, but he won't do it. And so Crito shows up, his best friend. They've been warriors. They grew up in the same neighborhood and as young men. They fought together. Socrates was a war hero. And Crito comes in, and of course, Crito, being the really, really good friend, says, Socrates, don't do this. We're going to get you out of here. And you just imagine the scene. Obviously, there's no real jail door. Crito just walks in. Right? He's just right there. And then beyond that, we know somebody's recording this, so maybe Plato's there as well. This is not what we would call a really brutal situation, except for the fact that Socrates is about to die. And the thing that makes Socrates matter than anything else when Crito comes in is Crito wakes him up. And Socrates says, why did you do that? Why did you wake me up? And Crito says, well, you're going to die soon. We need to talk. I'm not going to see you again. And Crito says, I'm not worried about that. Socrates says, I'm not worried about that. Crito asks why. Well, Socrates says, I've just had this dream. In fact, you interrupted the dream. And in that dream, a woman dressed in all white came to me and said, in 3 days, I will be in the realm of my ancestors. Now, there's all kinds of crazy Christian symbolism in that, even though it's a good 400 years before Christ is born. But just imagine, we always think of Socrates as the founder of philosophy, and therefore we think of him as this rigorous guy in the way of John Rawls. And yet, that's not it at all. What mattered most to him was this completely irrational dream he had, in which he's going to be in heaven in 3 days. And so be it. Right? But he's not alone. Right? We jump forward a little bit. Think about what happens for those of you who've read the Aeneid. What happens in the turning point in Book 8? It's Venus, the goddess of love, who descends to her son Aeneas and gives him the suit of celestial armor. And for those of you who know St. Paul, almost everything St. Paul writes in his letter to the Ephesians, especially about the armor of God and the sword of the Spirit, is almost word from word from the Aeneid. And that's amazing. Paul's not a liar. Paul's classically educated. And he understands there's a tradition here. And think about that woman. Right? We don't even have to talk about Mary for a moment. King Arthur, who gives him the sword. Lady of the Lake bestows this upon him. Think about the great king, the great first English king, King Alfred. Right? He's distraught. The pagans are coming in. They're attacking the British Isles. He has to unify everybody. And in his moment of trying to decide, why is God not helping me? Because I'm doing everything I need to do. I am beating these Danes back, and I can't win this battle. In the middle of that, Mary appears to him. And she says to him beautifully, right, this is what you have to do. Right? You have to gather men from sunken ford, paving, and fen. Why? To do God's will. And you can see Alfred, for a moment, is taken with this. And then Mary gives him the absolute lowest blow. And by the way, don't expect victory. In fact, if anything, the sky will grow darker and the sea will rise higher and the silence will sink. It doesn't matter if you have the victory or not. What matters is the struggle. And that, I think, in that mythic beauty, we see that over and over again. So Elisabeth gorgeously talked about wisdom. Beauty in the ancient world was always akin to wisdom. And wisdom was always a woman. Even if we go back and look at the Apocrypha of the Old Testament, there in the book of wisdom itself, we are told that wisdom is a woman. We know that. We know that this is this gift, this is this beauty, this image that we can see. And I don't think that that's accidental. I don't think it's accidental that we can trace a lineage of these witnesses, seeing these visions, whether they have them or not. The fact that these stories emerge in so many different cultures. And I'll give you 2 more examples of this. This shouldn't have happened. But if any of you have ever read the creation story of the Lakota Indian, long before they knew anything about the Europeans, they had a story in which a woman in white, wearing white buffalo robes, appears to 2 Sioux warriors. And she, to them, says, I will give you the law. I will give you everything. How to understand nature, how to work with one another. And of the 2 men, one drops down in respect and understands this is the divine, this is wisdom. And the other looks at her and thinks, this is the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and he lusts after her, and he disintegrates. He's gone. Right? This is the end. This is so important to understand that our love of beauty can be perverted, but it's also this understanding that this is a gift. It has to be understood. It has to be passed on. And so here we are, and you'll have to forgive me as someone being raised and still practicing, not always very well, but practicing my Catholicism. We're in the Lenten season. And I don't know how many of you have ever had a chance to read T.S. Eliot's beautiful Ash Wednesday. But he gives us this image, and Eliot had converted to Christianity in 1927, still wrestling with it, still trying to figure out what it means. And a few years later, in Ash Wednesday, he makes this kind of bizarre but yet utterly beautiful statement in which he says, Lady, 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree in the cool of the day. She honors the Virgin in meditation. We shine in brightness. I don't know what else could explain the darkness and yet the beauty of Lent. Right? As we approach Tenebrae, as we approach Good Friday, as we approach the resurrection. Again, however we take that, if that's our religious belief or it's just a story, it's an incredible story in every way. And I think this is what we have to bring back into the world. It's not going to be easy. But I think about all of those writers who survived World War I, and what do? They come back after the horrors, the hell of the trenches, and they give us The Hobbit, and they give us The Lord of the Rings, and they give us the Space Trilogy and Narnia, and that is not accidental. This is survivor's guilt. These are people like Lewis and Tolkien trying to make something beautiful out of a horrific world. They're trying to find that one bright star, that one thing that can hold them together. And I think that's stunning. And yes, I'm a conservative, but my conservatism has nothing to do with our current president or our speaker, not Speaker of the House, right? Our Senate Majority Leader. My conservatism has to do with a very, very hard struggle, sometimes very poorly executed, attempt to conserve the best that has come before us so that we can hand that on to future generations. Not just the videos of people beating the snot out of each other on the congressional floor, or just, again, the cats, right? It has to be something more than that. And I think that there is more than that, but we so willingly turn an eye to it. We become so cynical and so jaded. And I'm not utopian. I realize none of this is going to be fixed overnight, but nobody ever thought that. I mean, who in this room believed that when Socrates took the hemlock in 399, he was thinking, yes, 2,400 years from now, a young man, Gleaves Whitney, will have a program in which at least 2 of the speakers will bring me up again, and therefore it will all be worth it. Socrates doesn't think that. He does the right thing. And it's a terrible moment. And yet here we are. We remember him. He's not alone. Cicero was murdered by Mark Antony. Not just murdered, he was beheaded and behanded. Right? This is horrible, and we see this over and over again. Antigone, right? Fictional, but there she is. Perpetua, Felicity, Cecilia, right? The litany of those who have died for what they believe it's not just in the Christian world, it was in the pagan world too, and it remains, right? That moment of trying to understand these things. So I want to end with this. And this was one of Russell Kirk's favorite writings. I started with Kirk, I want to end with Kirk. But I want to end not with Kirk himself, but something he loved. And specifically, this is J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote about the meaning of the human person. And he wrote this to his student. They had very different politics in every way. They had very different sexualities, everything. But they still greatly admired one another. This was W.H. Auden. And they understood the greatness in each other, no matter how different they were in their lifestyle as well as in their politics. And Auden, at one point, writes to Tolkien in the 1960s and just says, you know, I know you've told everybody that The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. It's not, Sauron is not Stalin. This is not just about World War I or about World War II. It's much, much greater than that. And yet, you're an English professor. Tolkien held the greatest chair in Oxford for most of his career. You're an English professor. So tell me, what is it? How can you reconcile allegory with myth? And this was Tolkien's answer. He said, it's very simple. Each person is an allegory. Each person is an allegory. Why? Because each person embodies in a particular story and is clothed in the garments of his time and place, universal truth and everlasting life. I know of no better definition of the human person. Every one of us, unrepeatable, centers of dignity, of liberty, and yet we'll never be here again, but for this one moment, whether it's 20 years or 80 years or 90 years, for this one moment, we can demonstrate what is true and good and beautiful. It's our choice. Thank you.
Thank you. Two remarkable scholars of powerful imagination and analytic ability and the gift of communicating really profound things to us. Thank you so much. That was great.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like very directly to ask you something. And by the way, the format of this is I'm just asking a question now so that we can get things started with some more thoughtful responses. But we also want to hear from you. I want to know what you are thinking about the possibilities of common ground in this very, very needful time that we live in. Is common ground just a chimera, or is it something that's actually achievable? So please be thinking of your questions to put especially to them. I'll weigh in, perhaps. And I want to know what you think and what the Hauenstein Center should be doing to advance this ambitious project. And when I say common ground, I do not mean the frivolous common ground that we so often hear about procedure. Oh, well, let's agree about process. No, I don't mean that. And I don't mean about an agenda item that no one really cares about. That's common ground on the cheap. We're not talking about that. We're talking about principled common ground, actionable common ground that respects the deepest convictions, the highest thought of what people bring to the table. And that's what makes it tough, real tough. So I have a question for you. As you all are formulating your thoughts, I have a question for you too. What held us together as a community? And I know you talked with your father so much about this too, Christopher Lasch. What held us together as a community when you were young, and what holds us together now? Elisabeth, and then Brad, if you would address that too.
Well, that's a difficult question because I was young at a time the nation was really, pitted against one another on many issues. In many ways, that era is still what's stirring things now. But I was also a child. This was a very prominent thing in my household growing up. I was a child at the time of the civil rights movement, and that is one of the most amazing mass movements, interracial movements. And I'm speaking of the first half of it, not what happened in the later 60s when even people in the civil rights movement were disagreeing with each other on militantism and black power and things. But the portion that changed the law and this nation had to be it had to be that major and to bring about the sea change in this country, it had to be unified. And so when I was young, my family, one of the things we did on the weekends was go to civil rights marches, and sometimes they were even led by Martin Luther King. And so his death was one of the major tragedies also of my early years for our family and for this nation, along with other deaths, assassinations. So that's just to say people weren't all unified, but to bring about something like that meant that people did believe in, and I would also take the friendly amendment of small r, Republican principles and democratic principles, which I don't believe people thought were at odds with one another, but they were actually this beautiful blend of things that many had come to think was what the United States represented. Equality, everyone taken as a human person, and that comes very much out of the Judeo-Christian influences on the country too. So that was one of the sources of unity. Struggle, the sheer struggle of African Americans in this country who had contributed so much, and then the heroism and some of the stories and the myths of heroism that you're talking about apply to many unknown figures whose names we'll never know, but people who just resisted or contributed in some way, whether black or white, to that change. So I would say those are some of the bases for commonality, but again, I would go back to my talk and say that it's a beautiful vision that inspires people, a vision of what's possible, the imagination, and it really was a vision of love. It was the beloved community. People thought that if we as a nation brought justice to African Americans, we were bringing all African Americans into the polity as full citizens, full members. But it didn't mean anything like identity politics or group self-interest. All the different groups now can have self-interest. What it meant was way beyond the black experience itself, to a way to renew American democratic life and the republic. So.
Do you want to offer anything about today?
Today,
Or you
why
want to think about
why
that a
we
little bit
have
more?
what we have, or
What unifies us today?
I think that many of us still believe in those principles and values and that vision and are inspired by that in our life, but that we are drowned out by voices from the extremes. And on the sides there, I think there has been a serious departure from those principles and from traditions, from those long-term intellectual traditions that we're pointing to, where we got the sources for renewal for our commitment to things like valuing the human person, all human persons, unity, conversation, staying together in a conversation no matter how difficult or challenging. But we've lost a lot of those practices and principles. Not we, because I think in this room probably they're alive and kicking, but in many places, unfortunately, I think there has been a loss of those practices and also the sources for renewal in an understanding of the intellectual traditions that we have.
Thank you. Now, I want to see people start to come up. You know, I'm a teacher. I will cold call on you if I don't see people starting to come up and line up with these mics for your comments and your questions. Bradley, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I think what Elisabeth said is great. And this is so, I wouldn't even know how to start thinking about all the layers of where stability came from in my own life. But, so I grew up in a fairly well-to-do Kansas farm town, Hutchinson, Kansas. Very, very German. So basically everybody was Catholic or Lutheran or Amish. That was that kind of great divide in my hometown. But I know that I had all kinds of relatives. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was the oldest child of 17. So we had family everywhere. And, but I was also, so I was born in 67. So I didn't see some of the same kinds of struggles, and plus it was Kansas, so there's not, that kind of struggle wasn't. I was born in the summer of love. Yes, that's right. But I do think, I'm now, and I don't want to just sound like a kind of a grumpy middle-aged man, but there's no doubt that I was free-range parented. As long as I was back by dinner on a Saturday, it didn't matter where I went. I could go anywhere. And I did. That's what we did. We explored. My friends and I would get on our bikes and we'd ride and we'd explore. And then my mother's a teacher, and so I was introduced to books very early. And so if I was at home, I was reading. And I think that for me at least, those two things of having that, just being able to kind of learn what life is in the world, but also then reading, that was a great combination. But I was telling my students this the other day, because this is a world so different from what they're growing up in. But you always knew you were really in trouble, not when the neighbor got mad at you, but when the neighbor called your mom. But everybody did that. It didn't matter if I was on our block or 3 blocks over. The rules still applied. And at some point, somebody comes out and you're in trouble. And I thought that was very healthy, in the long run. It was really scary, when you're 10. But looking back, I think that was a great thing. And I trusted those people, really trusted them, still do. Most of them have passed away. But, and the other thing, I'll just throw this out as well, and I think about Ralph Hauenstein. I am embarrassed about how many people I knew growing up who had served in World War II that I totally took for granted. That's what everybody did, right? That was that, and I find out later, and I had a lawn mowing business throughout all of grade school through high school. Many of these guys who passed away recently, one of the guys I mowed his yard every week, and he was so nice, Mr. Reinert. And I found out after he died, he had three some kinds of medals. I don't remember. He was a decorated World War II vet, 3 medals. That's wow, amazing. But he'd never said that to me. I had no idea. And that there's a quiet patriotism that was very stable, I think.
Thank you. I think we have some people who want to. Yes, please, Chris, go ahead.
Thank you for doing this. This is very important for a lot of our culture. And I just wanted to, first of all, I am an advocate for free-range parenting, so.
You can get in trouble for that now, very
well,
quickly.
I know you could, but except for unless you live up north in the rural area, you can send the boys out during the day and have them come home in the evening. It's all good. You mentioned a lot of the videos at our age, and I think that we are in the age of image, because we have we're just inundated with images all over the place. And video games in particular, you mentioned, where one can be a good guy, where we're playing out that moral imagination within those video games. But I'd like to add that I think they can also be the bad guy, because their moral imagination has been ill-formed. And so there's no clear good versus evil, and they're play acting some of that out. And even in the popular fairy tales that we have now, it's very hazy. There's even it's all about a liberation from that tradition and that old age. And so we know that to be shallow. We know that those of us that are really seeking the more, we look for, what do we have? What were some of the traditions that were passed down in our family? What were some of the traditions intellectually? And what are some of the traditions within our communities? But, and I really appreciate the way that you talked about digging down to those roots. And I think that's very important. What my question that I would throw out to all of you is, what about those that don't even know how to dig? They don't even know what a shovel is for. And I'm not talking about the loud talking heads that do know what a shovel is and they don't want anything to do with it. That's the ugly part. Those that were not formed in any sort of tradition, and they don't know how. They know they want something more, but they don't even know where to begin. And so you hand them a shovel and they don't know how to use it. That's my question.
Thank you. Elisabeth, do you want to?
Sure. Well, that was a wonderful comment. I thought the same thing when you brought up the video games that it would be nice if they were always taking the side of the good guy, but there's some really awful material out there that allows you to take the bad guy position. And so what can we do, you're saying? So there are many people who don't have a moral compass. So when we see any kind of, I call them cultural artifacts, but from our own time, like a movie, say, we, or anyone with a good moral compass might interpret that movie one way, but someone who doesn't have that and never had that kind of parenting or education, just nothing, no, relative helped guide the person, but maybe sat the person in front of TV from the time they were really young, and so they never really got that grounding. Well, whatever it is, there are people who would see that and interpret it completely differently. And that is terrifying, because they might interpret it to mean that taking that very evil role, and some of these video games, I'm not trying to get too negative on video games, because there's some really wonderful young people who use the video games as a hobby, and they become very good at the skill of things, and there's some incredibly positive video games now, because there's been a recognition that this was very awful. So I don't want to just dismiss a whole genre. I never want to do that. I always want to try to be open-minded that there could be a good set of things. So I think, what do you do given that is a crisis, a moral crisis? There's no common wisdom that we can kind of assume everyone's imbibing, and then they're going to see those movies or those video games or hear things said. So obviously education is absolutely crucial, because sometimes people aren't going to get that in their family. They might not have even had really a family per se. They might have had people, helping them survive physically, but that might be about it. So education is very important. But I think another way to look at it is, we often think of popular culture as this thing on the side, as, oh, that's just for entertainment and things like that. But actually, given the breakdown of traditional families and schools and the moral kind of aspect of those things, popular culture should be rephrased, I think, and be called popular education, because that's where people are getting their messages. And the omnipresence of the electronic forms of media make that even more so. Maybe it was always that way. Maybe culture was always one of the main instructors. But now we really have to think in those terms, that might be the only thing instructing some people. So what it all comes down to is what it always has, and that is the efforts of every single person every day in whatever line of work they're in. If someone was in the line of work of creating video games, you could either go the bad route and make it very nebulous morally and make it really fun to be the bad guy murdering people, or you could make sure that you made ones that have a moral groundwork, and maybe even reward good moral behavior. But it's that in every single profession. But I think we have such a dominance of marketplace values that a lot of times even really well-meaning and maybe morally good people are making bad decisions, because they're not realizing the ramifications of these decisions. Someone in advertising, for instance, could put out, you said it's a culture of images, they could put out responsible images that really, each image teaches so much. But there's a lot of terrible images that are teaching such bad things. So I think every single person in whatever line of work you are, and sometimes just, I call them everyday acts of heroism, sometimes just smiling at someone means that person who was thinking of doing a really bad thing, someone smiled at them. And these things are inestimable in terms of how important they are.
Thank you for the comment. Where did you go, by the way? I'm sorry. There you are. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a great comment, and I certainly didn't want to suggest all video games are good. I wanted to get at that I think it's providing something that young people need that they're not getting elsewhere. Now, whether we give it to them correctly or not may be a totally different subject, but I do think there's an impetus there, a desire to be involved in something important. Now, maybe it could be denigrated, and I think it probably is quite often, but I do think there's a healthy, at the bottom, at the root, there's something healthy in the desire, even if it's played out in the wrong way. In the same way that I think no matter how many bad mythological stories are circulating right now, there's so many good ones too. And I think it just tells us the power of myth more than whether the myth is good or bad. So I mean, I would throw that in as well. But I do think, I really like the way you're thinking about, how do we present this to people? And for me, and I don't want this to be a cop-out, and it's given me more comfort as I've gotten older, I think when we're all younger, we believe we can change the world in a moment. And the older we get, we realize how difficult that is. But what we can do, obviously, I mean, we're making choices at every single moment. You're making a choice right now, as am I, several, in fact. And that is important to understand because this doesn't end, right? Until we're done, these choices are there. And I think that if we start thinking that we can change the whole world, we're starting to miss the picture. I think we have to focus on our family, our neighborhood, our friends. I think it's really important that we do that more often than thinking, and I see students, if I can go out to DC and I can become a speechwriter or I can change everything. Well, maybe, right? But you can certainly change a lot with the people around you by being a good person, making good decisions, helping one another. I mean, and I'm reminded again, Russell Kirk had this, and I can't remember where he got this. It was from an Italian priest in the 1940s who basically always said, wherever you find yourself, that's where you light the candle. And that's all you can do, right? In the end, you can make that change. And at some point, it has to be good enough.
Thank you. Could I have a show of hands, please? How many of you would like to ask a question or make a comment? Let me get an idea of scale here. Okay, so let's keep our questions and comments and answers a little shorter so that we can get about 10 people in. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
You're up.
Yeah, thanks. I'll keep it very short. I have a question about civility in politics today. There was a time when Jerry Ford, a native son, in Grand Rapids when he was minority leader in the House, and Tip O'Neill, who was the speaker, would duke it out on the floor, and afterwards they would go golfing. Their families would have dinner together. How can we recover that? I mean, there was a sense of collegiality among our elected officials, regardless of what side of the aisle they were on, that seems to have been lost. And how can we get that back?
You're asking a great question, and that's precisely what we're trying to grapple with. And I think all three of us would argue that culture is the most important thing here, and that politics and our political struggles, our economic struggles, are downstream from what's going on in the culture at base. And so until the culture changes, until the constituents demand better of their elected officials, I don't think much is going to change, regrettably. I think they need to hear from us. And we need to offer that constructive criticism. It's a great question, but...
Well, thanks, Gleaves, for organizing the seminar and our
thanks for being here.
Too. It's great.
Appreciate it. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Thank you so much for that. And I'm reminded, you may remember this, but Tip O'Neill did not want to meet Reagan sooner rather than later because he knew he'd like him. And he kept delaying, and then of course they ended up really liking each other. And it's a different world, isn't it?
The two Irishmen.
Yeah, the two Irish, yeah.
Professor Zivy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for putting this together, for the comments. I have to tell you, I teach political theory, history of political thought, so I'm so on board with you in terms of what kind of ways of thinking and imagining we want to be cultivating. And so I have two questions. One, of course, is sort of the elephant in the room, which is something that Gleave spoke to. what do we do about the dismantling of public education, the attack on the humanities? So that's one question. But the other question is about whether in the resources that you draw on in these texts, whether you find some resources for thinking about change in a way that involves sacrifice. And I ask this because I teach a Peter Singer article, and there's a quote that says, we need to change our moral conceptual schemes, right, if we want to make change in the world and be more helpful, but with it, we have to alter our ways of life. And I think that's what's one of the conversations we're having in this moment is not just how do we find common ground in terms of moral principles, but how do we find common ground in recognizing that to bring about change, to address tribalism, to have collegiality and civility, we may actually have to give things up like privilege, like economic power. So I was just hoping that you can draw on, if you can help us see where in Plato or wherever, we can find some answers to that. Thank you.
You want to start?
Well, I have trouble separating principle from practice because I think ideas have so much to do with how we do behave and act, and so some of the principles that you get from Plato and some of the other philosophers, as you well know, are things like humility, knowing your own limits, remembering that we are not gods. There's a difference between gods or God and mankind. So I think if those principles could help inflect the decisions that we make about what to do, I think that would be good. But you're absolutely right about the need to find sustainable ways of life. And I would say that sacrifice is one of those principles that you can find in the tradition of political philosophy that would come in very handy today.
That was great. I really appreciate the question. I will only say I don't have an answer at all, and I get so frustrated with conservatives because if you look back at the beginning of conservatism with people like Albert J. Nock or people like Russell Kirk, the liberal arts were everything. And now you get radio personalities who just mock people for majoring in the liberal arts, and it's not healthy at all.
Next question. Yes, Chuck.
Yeah, I hate to be the critic or the cynic, but it seems to me that you've got it reversed. The culture is not really the egg; it's more the chicken. And the egg is the forces that produce the culture. If you have a country that's poor and has a dictatorship, you have a different culture. No matter, you cannot rise to a better culture. Maybe you do over time, but I think the underpinnings for all of us is the concerns of the economic disparity that's coming about and growing, the corruption of our political system with influence peddling being very, very strong, the cynicism that comes out of that by the general citizenship, which feels disenfranchised, and the culture, that culture coming about. And so I think everything you say I agree with. It's good to try and strive to be noble and good and consider every person equal under whatever God you believe in. But I think your concern should be a focus on those forces that produce the cultures. And it seems in the world, not just this country, we're going in a negative way.
Thank you, Professor Fisher.
Oh, I actually agree with every single thing that you said, so I'm sorry if I didn't bring that whole element in. I don't think the cultural causes the problems, but in many ways is influenced by exactly the things that you're talking about.
Okay, I forgot to say one thing. I think it's good that we have the two sides, political, ideological concepts, and that they're alive, because every issue has two sides that should be rationally considered and with civility to bring a common answer to that. And the problem is it's skewed.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
This kind of follows up on both of those previous questions. What resources do each of you see in the various traditions you're focused on to decrease fear and increase courage? Because part of what I see in the political scene today is if the other side wins, we will have nothing. It's completely binary, it's winner take all, and the losers will probably wind up in camps. It's fascinating to me how much that fantasy exists on both sides. But the resources which you speak about, Socrates going to his fate, and Tolkien's characters finding courage in the worst of circumstances, where can you see those coming from in the things that you love and that you've been fed on and that you have grown in?
Thanks, Rick. Oh, gosh, I'm not sure I have an answer for you. Rick, it's very good to see you, by the way. This is it's a funny thing, and all I can really say is, at least my experience of having taught at a liberal arts college now for 20 years, I'm always, and I taught 1 year at Colorado as well, so I've had a slightly different experience, but not much. I've really just been at Hillsdale most of my career. But I am always amazed at how many people will think that students really just want kind of a subjectivism and they can think their own thing. That has not been my experience. I have found that young people over time hunger for something that they can grab onto in the best way. They love story, they love knowing these things. Now they'll play the game. They know if one professor wants this and they're very ideological, they'll play it. But I don't think it's really what they want. I think they really are craving certain kinds of things that are not just ephemeral, but really do have meaning to their lives and maybe to the lives, to understand their own parents and to think about what's coming after them. That's been my experience. But I think that they, at least for me, but I also get to teach. I teach American Revolution, I teach American Civil War. I get to teach all of these people doing all of these sacrificial things all the time. So I probably have a skewed view.
You want to go, Joe?
Well, you're so right about that, the level of fear and the need for courage. The conspiracy thinking has just caught on like wildfire on all sides, everywhere you look, and people can seemingly believe almost anything. And I think that's partly the new media allows for that wonderful aspect of someone could write a book and maybe never get it published in the big publishers, but then post it on Amazon. But it also frees up the space for lots of people to be saying things and very little to be sort of navigating and saying which are the more sound views that are based on evidence and that come from a principled position and things. That used to be the role of editors and people at the head of many different kinds of institutions. And so we don't have that as much. And then niche marketing, where so much, it's sort of the idea that, well, we could sell something to some group and then we can make money. Well, you can do that with any group, and it's not all on the same good level. And some very bad niches are out there. So I think, what can we do? You all have answers as much as us. I think we need more courage from those who have a more moderate voice or a principled voice. Maybe not always moderate. Maybe it could be very impassioned for something like for justice or equality, or impassioned protest against the widening rich-poor gap that's passion. So I don't want to say moderate all the time, politically moderate maybe, or centrist leaning, or just really people who are willing to stay in the same conversation and really fight for what is good and right in this world, which is courage. So.
Okay, we have time, I think, at least for 2 more questions. Ma'am, you will be next, and then, yes, and then on this side. And if anybody else want to get their oar in their water, now's the time to let me know. That's why we're going to cut this off at about 1:45, okay? Yes, ma'am.
Right. Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful experience, and I'm glad that I was here. However, as I look around the room, I am the elephant in the room. And I think that's very important to recognize. There's one black woman in this room, and we are here talking about common ground. And perhaps when I looked at the email that I received, because I'm a former faculty member here, I thought, well, common ground, we must be talking about things that are probably more centralized than what we hear this afternoon. However, many of the things that we've discussed really do pertain to where we are as human beings now. You brought forth your involvement and your teaching through the civil rights movement. I'm 80 years old, nearing on 81, so I've been looking at this for a very long time. If we are talking about common ground, why am I the only African American person here, or the only visible person of color in this room? Where does common ground begin? Does it begin out here in the areas out there where it doesn't really physically, emotionally, or mentally impact us, or is it right in front of you? Is it next door, down the street, around the corner, down the road? We kind of tend not to want to go there. And when we say that we are thinking about common ground, whose common ground is it? Have you examined the people whose common ground does not look like yours and tried to find a way to meld those common grounds? I am concerned about this because I intended to come to the earlier sessions you had as well, but hip replacement surgery kept me out. Old age has its disadvantages, I'll tell you. It's not for the meek or for the wimps. And so I wanted to say that I think this business, you just said, if the other side wins, we will have nothing. Or you said that, I think. One of you did, yes. And that's one of the issues I think we're confronting right now in this not so United States of America. And if the other side wins, we will have nothing, is what we are now working out of. Can common ground for a discussion in a community like Grand Rapids be simply, can we understand that if the other side wins, we all win? Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I just loved your comment. I mean, that's what we have to do. I have written down here, one thing I wanted to say was all of the talk about the possible crisis at the borders. The crisis is in the interior, and it's not a possible crisis. That one we know is real. The idea that, you know, that people are thinking that if one side wins politically, the other one might actually have to be out of the country or, you know, rounded. Now that is terrifying, and we have enough examples of fairly recent history to show that that's a crisis when people start thinking that way. I don't want to be part of any United States of America that isn't fully interracial, completely interracial. I mean, interracial marriage, families. I'm in a mixed family myself. If my fellow citizen who's black, a person of color, or from another country, what have you, is not going to be treated equally, and that person's body and rights are not going to be protected, I don't want citizenship here anymore. And I love this country, and I have many people in my family, going back to capital P populists, the Populist Party working for farmers' rights and civil rights, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning grandfather who wrote one of the first editorials critical of our involvement in Vietnam and things. So we have a lot of dedication to this country, but still, I seriously will seek citizenship elsewhere. And there are a lot of people like that, but then there are these really terrorist groups in our country. You know, it's unbelievable that after all the achievements of the civil rights movement, we'd have to be thinking about that. But we do, and we have to end that. So that does mean that all of these places of hope, like here at the Hauenstein Center, or at my Maxwell School of Citizenship, or wherever there's any hope with a neighborhood, as you said, talking to your neighbors, knowing your neighbors, protecting the rights of the neighbors, wherever that is, we have to have courage and make sure that this country continues to strive to become what it is trying to be. Of course, we'll never get there, but we're supposed to be striving and getting closer to the ideal all the time, not getting further away.
And we have, from polling, we see that more and more Americans than in years believe that we're drifting towards civil war. Now, what exactly that war would look like, of course, is very different from the Civil War of 1861 to 1865, but the fear now, the anxiety about the deep divisions in our country, whether it's rich versus poor or something, another configuration, there's a lot of apprehension about where we're going. This is one of the reasons that President Lubbers here in the front row, and I know you've known him from way back, but President Lubbers and I were having this conversation 7 years ago when we first started thinking about pulling a common ground program at Grand Valley together. And I told him, I said, we'll lead that effort. And we need these voices to diffuse this situation and find practical ways to make progress. Let me just use one very concrete example, and that's Paul. I see you sitting in the audience there. We were just at a wonderful polarity thinking workshop a couple of evenings ago in which we talked about the ways that you take the ways our issues are polarized in this country right now. And you've got to have respect for the other side, however the other is defined there. And you have to take into account, and polarity thinking is a way, and I refer you to the work of Barry Johnson to read more about this. Polarity thinking is a way of fully accounting for how the other side is viewing reality, an issue, a problem that they face, that you don't face. And that's a way, that's a pragmatic way of dealing with this issue. Or I'd point also to Bob Quinn from the University of Michigan. We had him come in and talking and sharing core stories with one another, where you sit down with a neighbor that you really haven't gotten to know, and you share 3 stories each, so a total of 6 stories are conveyed, and then the 7th session you're actually talking to each other about what you have in common out of the core of your experience and how you identify in your community. So there are ways, and at the Hauenstein Center we're going to continue to push this, and we're going to push it in our Cook Leadership Academy so that the young people coming up, this also addresses those of you who've expressed some pessimism, so that the young people coming up both have an intellectual understanding of the problem and some tools directly to confront it. So that's what we're going to be doing. Brad, did you want to?
No, I have nothing else to add. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad for the comment. Thank
Okay, I know
you.
you've been very patient. Please, your question, and then, yes, Monica, we'll get to yours. Okay.
Yeah, is this on?
I don't hear it.
I don't hear it.
We need this microphone hot. Try again.
Okay, now it's on.
Okay.
I really appreciate this discussion, and I'm really grateful for the woman who said she's almost 80 because I want to be like her when I grow up. And it just strikes me, yes, that we cannot have this conversation without acknowledging privilege. And the fact that we're having this in the academy, and that's where it seems like most of these conversations are happening. How is the academy then taking this conversation out into the masses, I guess, the rest of the world, so that we can have, because I'm guessing this is a very different conversation, and how we're defining common ground is very different than it would be in the community center or the church basement or, wherever else you might be going. So I just wanted to say that really quickly. And then the other point that I wanted to make was piggybacking on Elisabeth's message about love. I listened to an episode of Hidden Brain recently where they were talking about same-sex equality. And one of the ways that they achieved it so quickly, they were talking about how can we move the needle? How did the society move the needle so quickly on something that was so incredibly polarizing? And part of the pivot point was same-sex marriage, which comes down to love, how we love one another, and appealing to that common humanity. What strikes me now is that we are, yes, we're divided, but we're also extremely united in what we're against. And everything seems to be about, what am I against? What am I resisting? It strikes me that in order to really be united, it's going to need to be around love. Like, what are we for? What are we creating instead of what are we resisting? I'm curious if you have any insights about, do you see any seeds of hope about something that you feel like could unite us around love and creation? Because right now it all feels like it's about resistance on both sides.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Elisabeth?
Oh, I wanted to talk very fast because we have someone waiting. I do see hope, and I don't think I'm a utopian at all. I just want you to know that. It must have sounded a bit like that, but I think love is very, very practical and has everyday ramifications and comes out of everyday experiences of all of us. We experience love. We know what that is. So I am writing this book, so I tried to gather as many good examples of that exact thing and other less desirable examples as well. And I think across the popular culture, you see this coming up again and again and again in movies that often seem to be about other things or often seem to bring up conflict and things. Still, there will be a nugget of an interest in love. And just one quick example would be the movie Gladiator. Many people know about that. And it's supposed to be like the stoic movie of our time. And it's a lot of warfare and revenge and all kinds of things. But it also is about love. And so these messages are there. And I would just say that I don't think we should ever assume anything about anyone before we've met them, by the basis of their appearance or anything we see, because our eyes deceive us or other senses. We should not assume about people. We should get to know them. Their pasts and identities are very complex. And there could be a person who looks like a Caucasian who's not at all. There could be a person of color who actually does have privilege. Although I shouldn't have said that example, because I am very concerned about what you said about we really have to start looking at this haves and have-nots, and why is it getting worse, and can we stop this? But I think starting by letting someone tell their story about what they believe in or what they're dedicated to, because it's not just in the academy that these discussions are possible or are going on. There are many people living, lives outside of universities, colleges, and such, who believe wholeheartedly in these values and practice them all the time.
No, it was a great question. Anything I would say, I mean, it's just metaphysical. In my mind, love is eternal. It's that which moves the stars. So it's everything.
Last question, Monica.
Yes, this isn't so much a question as it is a comment. I love the question on how do we establish common ground, and you also asked where are examples of where this is happening. My son just started attending university this fall, and I am blown away at two things that are happening as he is attending his first year of university. First of all, the school sent out a book to every incoming freshman that is specifically designed to promote the idea of diversity and inclusion as required reading. And for 6 weeks after the reading of this book, they got together in diverse groups and spent time on a weekly basis discussing diversity and inclusion. That is a vehicle for establishing common ground. Another example is at this specific university, they have a multi-faith center, which 12 leaders of over 12 different religions come together on a regular basis with the students that practice those religions. And their goal is to come together in service to the community and to give back. I think those are two great ways of promoting common ground, and I think it's something that everybody in this room has the ability to get involved with and sponsor and promote within the communities in which they live. Thank you very much for promoting this discussion.
Thank you. Syracuse, isn't it? Monica, are you referring to Syracuse? Yes, so, yes, okay. Since that's Syracuse, is that something that you care to respond to? Or-
She said it perfectly.
But Hillsdale also encourages service and, I mean.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, very good. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your indulgence, allowing us to run
you.
over. So appreciate your attendance and your engagement in this vital issue. Keep coming back to our Hallenstein Center programs as we grow them and explore the deeper sources of common ground, something that's a lot more than you're going to find on TV or in video games. So thank you so much. We're adjourned.